So my name is Michael Penn. I teach in the Stanford Religious Studies Department, and I want to welcome you to the fourth of five Ptarmigan mini lectures taking place this academic year. The series showcases senior as well as exceptional junior faculty. But instead of presenting a traditional research presentation, we've asked participants to instead use the classroom lecture as their model. We've allocated exactly 1 hour for this. During the presentation, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Anuja Amin, one of our department's PhD students who has overseen this series, will curate submitted questions and present them to our speaker. We are privileged to have with us today Dr. Shaily Patel, who is Assistant Professor of Early Christianity in the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. She's the author of numerous publications and is currently working on a book project titled Peter the Magician, Discourses of Magic in Early Petrine Traditions. Today, Dr. Patel will be speaking to us on the topic of magic in early Christianity. And with that, I'm going to disappear and pass the virtual microphone on to you, Dr. Patel.
Thank you so much. I am going to quickly share my screen here. And before I get started, so good evening, everyone, or afternoon, if you're there at Stanford. Thank you, Professor Penn, for that introduction, and many thanks to the Stanford Department of Religious Studies and all the organizers of the Ptarmigan mini lecture series for inviting me to speak with you today. I want especially to thank Anuja Amin and Teresa Mooney for making things run so smoothly behind the scenes. That's not always easy. When I started planning this talk, I wanted to keep in mind the scope of this lecture series and deliver something fun and accessible, introducing non-specialists to the problem of magic in early Christianity, and it is a problem. So I thought, what better way to figure out what people really want to hear than crowdsourcing on social media? I asked Twitter what they'd like to hear about in a lecture on magic in early Christianity. Now, I am not the most popular academic on Twitter, I own, but this tweet got dozens of replies. So this crowdsourcing experiment taught me a few things. First, that crowdsourcing was a bad idea on my part, because how was I going to write a lecture that met everybody's expectations? But more importantly, I learned that people were very interested in magic, and that most of those who replied already held some ideas about what ancient magic entailed. That is, when I asked what people would like to see in this lecture, people unsurprisingly answered with what they thought a lecture on magic should include. Here are some of the things Twitter wanted to hear about, in no particular order. I collated most of the responses so you can see what we moderns may associate with ancient magic. Some people associate it with material objects, like amulets and incantation bowls. Others think of magic as an idea, a discourse that overlaps with notions of medicine, philosophy, or what we might call religion. Still others place certain rituals alongside magic, exorcisms, healings, and spells, for example. And a few people want to know about magicians themselves. Was Jesus a magician? How would we know? What do magicians do anyway? On the one hand, my exercise was a bust, because again, how do you talk about all the things in 40 minutes? But on the other hand, my attempt showcases something that scholars of ancient magic have been saying for decades. When we moderns think about ancient magic, we tend to bring our own presuppositions into our analyses. We decide that ancient magic was about amulets or rituals, or that it was different from miracle. And because we choose what we include in our notions of magic, we sometimes miss the bigger picture, which is that ancient magic was a huge category with very fuzzy boundaries, including both practices and abstract ideas about magic's nature. ancient people used magic and also talked about it. Magic was a label applied to certain ritual experts, magicians, but it was also a range of practices that could be considered more or less socially or religiously transgressive, depending on the immediate context. In other words, ancient magic was unwieldy, contradictory, and very difficult to pin down. It was contested, to use the scholarly framing. And that's why when I asked Twitter what they'd like to hear about in this lecture, I got a variety of answers. Twitter is not wrong. Twitter is never wrong. Because while we certainly bring our own assumptions to bear on the study of ancient magic itself was so dynamic that many of our assumptions about it could be correct, depending on the text, the ritual, or the tradition that we're studying. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering how anyone makes sense of magic, given that it can be any or none of the things the people on Twitter named, or other things they didn't think of, or nothing at all. And yes, we have texts where magic is said to be nothing at all. So I always shy away from simple definitions, and I always say that magic was conceptually messy. But as historians, we attempt to create order out of this chaos. We try to figure out what our ancient writers meant when they called something magical or accused someone of being a magician. Now, I want to be clear, different fields will have different methods for how they approach this problem of ordering the chaotic world of Roman magic. But today I'm going to talk about the methods particular to scholars of early Christian literature, since this is my area of expertise, and since the subfield's ideas about ancient magic have consequences for how we understand modern religion. Many of you who've heard me speak before know that I think of history writing as a way of imposing conceptual control over the past. And what I mean is that most scholars recognize that large parts of the past can never be recovered. There's so much we just can't know. And some of the hardest data to recover pertains to the everyday lives of people who left behind the material objects and texts we've inherited. We may know a bit more about figures like church fathers, let's say Irenaeus or Tertullian, but what do we truly know about the everyday lives of Christians on the ground? Did Christian women dress as prescribed by Tertullian in his essay on the veiling of virgins, for example? Did believers in Jesus follow every rule set down in our Gospels? Did they think of Christianity the same way that our authors did? Because if you read Paul's letters, you'll realize his primary problem was that people didn't follow his rules. If they had, maybe he wouldn't have had to tell the Corinthian church that one shouldn't sleep with their stepmother. Paul aside, my point is that there's a disconnect between our literary sources for early Christianity and the real world lives of historical believers. And the latter of these things may be mostly lost to us. Okay, sure. But what does this have to do with magic, or even how scholars think about magic? Well, it seems to me that when talking about magic, many scholars overlook this gap between historical reality and how our texts describe it. They forget that our writers are also trying to create order from the chaos of ancient magic. And so when we analyze ancient sources, we rarely think about the processes our authors use to create magic in their own terms, to bring its conceptual messiness under Christian order. That means we take our authors at their word, and then we likewise impose a new order and redefine ancient magic for our ends. And because of this scholarly oversight, I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking with you about the how and why of defining ancient magic in early Christian texts, and what these definitions might tell us about those lived realities we've lost to time. So I'm going to give this lecture backwards in a way. I'll first talk about how scholars in my field order the chaos of ancient magic, and then I'll discuss some ancient evidence, that is, of Roman writers' own attempts at ordering magic, and how this attempt might disrupt modern scholarly conclusions. And finally, I'll turn to the main topic of early Christian literature, briefly showing how allowing magic to retain some of its contradictions might help us better understand our sources. Right. So let's start with what modern scholars usually think. According to the dominant framework in the study of early Christian literature, and again, I'll say I'm talking about this particular subfield. According to it, ancient magic is a negative label that one group or person levied at others. Magic itself didn't carry any content until it was used to trash one's enemies. So if we accept this framework, then any practice might be thought of as magic or miracle, depending on the circumstances in which it was performed or described. One of my favorite foundations or formulations of this way of thinking about magic is from a classic. And I promise I will zip through the scholarship quickly because I know this is supposed to be a classroom type lecture. So one of my favorites is from David Ani's essay, Magic in Early Christianity. He defines magic as a form of religious deviance, whereby intellectual or social goals are sought by means alternate to those normally sanctioned by the dominant religious tradition. He means that magic is religion not approved by the dominant establishment. And so for Ani, there's really no distinction in the essential practices of magic versus religion. What distinguishes the two is their social location. Magic is illicit and performed without the approval or permission of religious institutions. But the activities done by magicians and priests don't really differ much, if at all. And to him, meaning Ani, Christianity was magical because it was a deviant millennialist movement, according to the religious establishment of the time. So when we look back at something like Jesus's exorcisms and healings, we can think of those as magical within the Roman context. But this also means that they can become miracle when Christianity earns a dominant position. Another work that New Testament scholars often appeal to when talking about ancient magic is Susan Garrett's Demise of the Devil. Garrett imagines magic's deviance to concern more than just groups. For her, magic is about relationships between one individual and another who has been labeled a magician. Quote, labeling someone a magician was an effective way to squelch, avenge, or discredit undesirable behavior, she says. According to her, someone like the author of the Acts of the Apostles labels Simon a magician in order to discredit him and align him with demonic powers. So this would then exclude magicians like Simon from the Christian community in Acts by making Simon an emissary of Satan. And any believers who would have read or heard the story of Simon Magus in Acts 8 would then know to stay away from magicians and their magic. Garrett's book is the last major book-length project to take on magic in early Christian literature, and it was published in 1990. More recent scholars have tried to define magic in shorter projects, and I've put a couple of them on this slide. You can see Justina Kalos, for example, understands the concept of magic as a discursive category dependent on the perceiver, an ancient perceiver as well as a modern one. Kalos claims that no one considered their own rituals and beliefs as constituting magic in late antiquity. And so like Ani and Garrett, Kalos sees magic as a label applied to outsiders who've been discredited by more powerful players. And in her case, the dominant group is Christianity. Finally, Larry Hurtado writes, by definition, magic involves secretive ritual acts that do not function as the corporate and identifying rituals of any given group. It was not a public expression of religious affiliation, but a private practice. So Hurtado defines magic in terms of private practices versus public ones. Private practices done in secret would be considered magic, but practices people perform publicly are religious. Before I talk about what these approaches miss, I want to give two caveats. I don't think all of these scholars are saying the exact same thing. For Ani and maybe Hurtado, what defines magic is its place outside established religious structures. Garrett and Cullis think about how ideas of magic emerged in situations of religious competition and were used to discredit enemy practitioners. All of these scholars are writing about different eras in Christianity's development too. From the very early days of the Jesus movement, as is the case with Ani, to the establishment of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire in Cullis's case. Despite these differences, these frameworks share two similarities, which is why I made you sit through this lit review. One is that there was some sort of rigid boundary between magic and what we'll call religion, and that everybody in the ancient world knew that magic was wrong and wouldn't have wanted to participate in it. And two, that magic was primarily a marker of transgression, and that the real difference between Roman magicians and Christian miracle workers lay in how their deeds were interpreted by ancient authors and communities. To be fair, these scholars aren't necessarily wrong. Magic was definitely used to mark outsiders or transgressors. And while it's tough to talk about ancient religion in the same way we think of religion today, our ancient writers did try to draw rigid boundaries between magic and what they deemed to be proper religion. But to me, this is a conveniently orderly way or an orderly solution to a very messy problem. And as I'll discuss here in a second, the evidence for ancient magic is contradictory and confusing, not orderly at all. We should also pay attention to something else. This modern scholarly framework takes for granted that our ancient authors are simply describing historical realities instead of trying to create their own order out of the chaos of ancient magic. In other words, we often mistake what's presented in ancient literary texts as a window onto the real lives of Christians. But as I explained earlier, texts just don't work that way. For example, in the modern world, we have laws that are codified and written down somewhere. In my home state of Virginia, apparently drivers are required to honk their horns when passing another car. I will confess I have never done this. I'm a lawbreaker. Nor have I ever seen any Virginia driver do this unless they're experiencing road rage. In fact, it would make for a pretty noisy drive on Interstate 81, which is its own kind of chaos. So I know this seems like a silly comparison, but I think it makes a point. Texts, even texts that set down rules, say for distinguishing between magic and miracle, don't reflect lived realities all the time. Instead, they might prescribe proper behavior for everyday people. They create order from chaos. But as I always tell my students, we should remember that this order is an illusion, and that part of our jobs as historians is to try and peel away the illusion as much as we can to see how and why chaos becomes order. Sometimes, if we read our texts with a healthy dose of skepticism, we can discover how ancient authors themselves grappled with the fact that magic was terribly difficult to pin down. This brings me to the second part of my talk. Evidence that troubles modern scholarly order. And I want to focus here on one of my favorite stories from the ancient world, that of Apuleius. In 158 CE, a scandal broke out in the port town of Ea. A smart, urbane philosopher by the name of Apuleius married the wealthy widow Pudentia. According to Apuleius, it's a standard story of Roman courtship. They meet, they court, and then they get married. And everything might have been fine, but Pudentia's own son and his uncle bring suit against Apuleius. The crime? Apuleius supposedly seduced his wife through means of magicorum maleficorum in the Latin, that is, evil acts of magic. Those who brought suit believed this newcomer wanted Pudentia's money, and Apuleius's apology contains the details of all these accusations, as well as the arguments he put forth in his own defense. Some scholars think that this text, the apology, preserves the real written account of his speech at trial. But even if that isn't the case, for scholars of ancient Rome, this text provides lots of insights into just how slippery magic was, even for writers of the time. And it also shows how problematic it is to limit magic to the tidy scholarly frameworks I just went through. So let me unpack some of the text for us. And then I'll talk about why the apology and Roman evidence like it matters for early Christian literature. One of the most fascinating things about Apuleius' speech is that it contains multiple ideas of magic, despite being one text written by one author. I have three of his definitions listed here. In the first, Apuleius says, if what I read in a large number of authors is true, namely that a magician is the Persian word for priest, what is there criminal in being a priest and having due knowledge, science, and skill in all ceremonial law, sacrificial duties, and the binding rules of religion? So already we have a Roman writer claiming that magic is religion, or at least Persian religion. So much for our rigid distinctions then between magic and religion. Apuleius further defines magic as an art befitting a king, an art no less that involves proper piety towards the gods. It's a sacred art, come to Rome from Persia. Now, this is a far cry from some scholarly notions of magic always being considered evil or demonic. Apuleius offers a second definition when he says Plato believed magical charms to be merely beautiful words. So magic is now defined as a type of charming, which may or may not have real world effects. He doesn't really elaborate on this idea, apart from claiming that he shouldn't be punished for appreciating beautiful words. Still, he's not done defining magic. A third definition emerges when he mocks his accusers. Quote, but in fact, these people understand magician according to the vulgar usage as a man who is able, through a communing with the immortal gods, to cause any miracle he wants with a special power of incantation. So magic is also a means by which individuals communicate with the gods and produce wonders through incantations. It must have some resemblance to philosophy as well, which is why unsophisticated people can't tell the difference between a good Platonist and a base magician. And so here we're seeing Apuleius give a definition of magic that aligns a bit more with modern scholars' views, that it's this base practice that isn't as sacred as, let's say, philosophy or religion. I really like using Apuleius' apology in my classrooms because it really clarifies the nature of the problem. In this one text, we have at least three definitions of magic, and that's not the end of it. Not only do we have the ways in which our author thinks about magic, we also get information about the evil acts that got Apuleius into trouble in the first place. So what did these magical deeds include? According to Apuleius' accusers, he purchased and dissected fish that looked like human genitalia, no less. Obviously, such animals could only be used for love potions. What else are you going to use them for? Apuleius had also made use of a young boy as a medium in shady divination rituals. He kept something hidden in a linen cloth on his household altar. And most seriously, he seduced his wife through love spells and might have killed one of her sons by magical means. The apology is basically a rap sheet of Apuleius' magical misdeeds. And because of this, it also offers the historians some insight into what I'm calling the chaos of ancient magic. In this text, we have an accusation of magic, Apuleius' own multiple definitions of magic, and we have the practices that resulted in his being brought before the court, those practices that supposedly prove that he was a magician. Trying to order the ideas and practices of ancient magic we find in Apuleius' apology is a little overwhelming. Kind of like crowdsourcing ideas for a talk and then getting dozens that you can't cover, right? Anyway, there's other Roman evidence which trouble scholars need frameworks for understanding ancient magic, and we can talk about those in the Q&A if you want to. But for now, I'd like to turn to some very brief case studies from early Christian literature. And I want us to keep in mind what we've learned from Apuleius, which is that magic isn't just about labeling your enemy to discredit them. Magic is more than mere words or abstract ideas. It also consisted of a number of practices, like the ones that got Apuleius in hot water. Now, to give you some sense of what practices counted as magic, here's a cheat sheet I borrowed from Radcliffe Edmonds' book, Trying Down the Moon. And again, I'm happy to talk more about Edmonds' methodology in the Q&A. But just to briefly summarize for you, Edmonds came up with this list, and this is not comprehensive, by analyzing a huge volume of Greco-Roman texts for activities that are explicitly called magic. Using this initial group, he then considered other mentions of the same activities, even when they weren't explicitly called magic. And so the idea then is that whether or not any given activity is explicitly termed magical in any given text, if it belongs to this larger stereotype of what constituted magic in the ancient imagination, then we can assume this activity was in danger of being interpreted as magical. The advantage of this approach is that it means we don't have to take Christian writers at their word when they insist that Jesus's exorcisms aren't magical. Instead, we can think about how our writers frame things like exorcisms and healings to prevent them from being interpreted as magical. We can see how our authors try to make order out of chaos. This sort of work in the field of classics and interdisciplinary work I find really helpful because Edmonds and others demonstrate how we have to look beyond accusations of magic in texts like the New Testament and think about the activities that would draw the accusation in the first place. To put it another way, there's a reason that Apuleius had to defend himself against particular practices and not others. Some activities that were thought to be magical could be more socially transgressive than others. So while both healings and necromancy could be magic, for example, necromancy is never described in a positive way, whereas healings could be. And this messiness in terms of ancient writers' conflicting definitions of magic, as well as what practices count as magic and when, presents a problem for early Christian writers and those of us who study them. These ancient authors are very clear in their dislike of all things magical. Magicians are evil and their power is satanic. Magic itself is wrapped up in heresy and can never be part of true Christianity. Nevertheless, at the same time, they write about the leaders of Christianity, figures like Jesus, Peter, and Paul, performing deeds like healings and exorcisms, which were part of this larger stereotype of magic in the ancient world. Now, if you think about it, this is a pretty serious contradiction, right? The modern scholars that I talked about earlier would resolve this contradiction by thinking of magic as a label. To them, one person's magic is another person's miracle. So there's no contradiction since our authors claim Jesus and his followers performed miracles and not magic, and therefore Jesus and his followers performed miracle and not magic. But to me, texts like Apuleius' Apology trouble this orderly understanding of magic. In the Apology, magic doesn't just reside in accusations. Apuleius' evil magical deeds had to be identified in order to bring charges, after all. And if Roman magic was about word and deed, that should prompt us to ask what we gain if we think of Christian texts being exposed to the same contradictory and unwieldy ideas of magic used by Roman writers like Apuleius. We could talk about several Christian texts to illustrate how considering magical deeds alongside accusations of magic can tell us something new about the texts themselves. But I'm going to very, very briefly talk about three. The author of the Gospel of Luke changes the text inherited from Mark to remove some of the most troublesome aspects of Jesus's deeds, those facets of Jesus's miracles that were more likely to draw an accusation of magic. Luke, in contrast to Mark, has Jesus perform his miracles in public, removes all the foreign words from Mark's miracle stories, all the Aramaicisms, and then deletes any destructive shows of Jesus's power with one exception. And though Luke tries to reduce how much Jesus's miracles resemble stereotypical magical deeds, our author keeps the deeds themselves. In order for Luke to lessen Jesus's resemblance to a magician, the evangelist must have some idea of what magical deeds look like in the first place. Luke must have been familiar with broader stereotypes of magic, and that can tell us something, and I'll get to that. Writing much later than Luke, the great church father Origen of Alexandria finds himself defending Christian exorcists against charges of magic levied by an earlier pagan philosopher, Celsus. Origen writes that Christianity and magic are, quote, two different species, and that Christians' exorcisms are performed through the name of Christ to better one's soul. Conversely, deceitful marketplace sorcerers use demonic aid to sell exorcisms and healings for a few obols. Know how both of these authors betray a kind of anxiety about Christian miracle being mistaken for magic. Luke and Origen disparage magicians in their own respective ways, sure, but are their warnings about magicians a description of what's happening on the ground, or a way to prevent Christians from seeking out magicians? There's good evidence to think it's the latter if we pay close attention to the how. That is, how our writers deflect charges of magic against Jesus and his followers. Both Luke and Origen do this through a literary bait and switch. By disparaging magic and magicians on the one hand, and then reframing Christians' own deeds as something other than magic, these authors change magic into miracle. They invent, or they help invent, a distinct category of wonder working and give their audiences the illusion that this new category is actually a thing. And it's pretty extraordinary if you stop again and think about it. Because today we think of magic as a kind of corruption of religion, or at least its unsavory counterpart. Early Christian texts like Luke and Origen, however, create miracle to distance Christianity from magic, the latter of which existed prior to Christianity. So in this way, our ancient authors hide magic in plain sight, trying to convince us that Jesus's exorcisms and healings are fundamentally different from those of ancient magicians, because Jesus's deeds are about things like freedom from demonic bondage, or the arrival of the kingdom of God, or the moral reformation of our souls. Miracles come with message, in other words. Now, if this is the how of magic in early Christian texts, then there must be a why. Why do Christian writers go through the trouble of creating this distinct category of wonder working? Why not just leave it at, but we don't do magic, bro? We can see more of both the how and why of magic in early Christian literature in a text like the apocryphal Acts of Peter, which is truly delightful if you haven't read it. The Acts of Peter is a fictional account of the magical contest between the Apostle Peter and the notorious Simon Magus. Scholars are divided on the date. Some say 2nd century, some say 4th century, but what we do know is that it was popular. It appears in several languages, including Greek, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopic, meaning lots of people were reading it all over the place. But that said, like, the text's popularity did not mean that it was accepted by church authorities. The great church historian Eusebius, for example, declares it heretical. And upon a cursory read, it's not difficult to see why church leaders might not have welcomed the Acts of Peter with open arms. According to some earlier scholars, the text has no coherent theology. Instead, what we have are stories of Peter performing a series of miracles, each more unusual than the last, and culminating in a showdown, a magical showdown, against Simon Magus in the Roman Forum. This text has a striking comfort with narrating Peter performing stereotypical magical deeds. But it also contains one of the meanest criticisms of an enemy wonder worker in early Christian literature. And together, these two characteristics help us go from simply trying to order ancient magic and define it to better understanding how it functions within texts. So let me start with stereotypical magical deeds in the text. To give a quick summary, in this text, Peter performs a number of deeds that are familiar from the canonical New Testament, exorcisms and healings, and vivifying the dead. But he also manages some rather unique feats. At one point, he charms a dog into speaking. He also makes a baby talk. In one instance, he takes a dried tuna fish from a shop window and makes it come alive and swim around for hours. And the text tells us that, for hours. Earlier scholars of ancient Christian literature would often remark on the strange nature of Peter's miracles in the Acts of Peter. These scholars dismiss the text as being frivolous or written solely for the purpose of entertaining the masses. And sure, making dried fish swim doesn't have the same gravitas as, say, Jesus raising Lazarus in the Gospel of John. But that doesn't mean Peter's deeds in the Acts of Peter are frivolous or meaningless. In fact, we are the ones who decided that the raising of Lazarus was more theologically significant than Peter's adventures in this text. More recent scholars, however, are taking the text more seriously as having theological importance. And when I talk about it, I try to show how Peter's miracles, even though they sort of seem frivolous on the surface, are an important means by which lapsed Christians are reconverted in the text. So I'll give you one example. In chapter 9, when Peter first arrives in Rome, he's persuaded to go to the home of the senator Marcellus, who is hosting Simon Magus. Peter asks that Simon come down to the door for a public confrontation. When Simon refuses, Peter charms a large dog into speaking and tells the dog to command Simon to come down. Once Simon sees the dog, he becomes speechless, and those around him are amazed by what Peter's done. Marcellus himself is so awed that he falls to his knees before Peter, begging him for mercy. Admitting that his faith, quote, was not firm, Marcellus claims he was led astray because Simon was able to pretend to be a god through his magic. Marcellus is now prepared to come back to the Christian community. Okay, at this point, we might expect Marcellus to be baptized or rebaptized or receive some Christian education because clearly the first round of education didn't stick. We would expect anything that proves that Marcellus's return is not prompted by a talking dog. But the Acts of Peter simply moves on to Peter's next miracle. And when Marcellus lapses again, not long after this episode, what finally solidifies the man's belief is the miraculous repair of a broken statue. And so after the repair of the statue, Marcellus believes with all his heart. The message of this little episode is fairly clear. Miracles solidify belief. In fact, Peter says this in his first speech to the community. Quote, I came not only for the sake of convincing you with words, but by reason of miraculous deeds and powers, he says. Later in the text, he makes an even stronger statement. Quote, we must not believe in words, but in works and deeds. So the miracles in the Acts of Peter and Peter's ability to sort of out-miracle Simon are designed to solidify belief and prove the superiority of Christian miracle over magic. Despite how earlier scholars dismiss this text, it does have a theological message. Deeds matter more than words. And that tells us something about the variety of Christian beliefs and practices. If the wondrous deeds and the acts of Peter are about solidifying belief, then what do we do with the accusation of magic? Because there is one. Magic is both deeds and ideas, after all. So here we'll turn to Peter's nemesis in the text, Simon. This author truly, truly hates Simon Magus. Unlike the canonical Acts, where Simon misunderstands Peter's authority and then slinks off asking for redemption, in this text, Simon and his magic are completely irredeemable. Before Peter even arrives on the scene, he's learned that Simon has, quote, perverted by cunning and power of Satan all of those who once believed. So Simon has successfully turned people away from the faith through his magic. The text places Simon's magic alongside a number of truly terrible events. What Simon has done is like enticing Adam to evil lust, forcing Judas to betray Jesus, hardening the heart of Herod, kindling Pharaoh against Moses, emboldening Caiaphas to deliver Jesus to the crowds. Simon is so much more than some random magician selling his spells in the marketplace. He is the very embodiment of evil. And so the battle between these two central figures in the text, Peter and Simon, becomes this cosmic battle between God and Satan, between good and evil. Clearly, these strong criticisms are meant to deny any similarities between Peter and Simon, and consequently between Christianity and magic. We see rigid divisions like this in lots of Christian texts. In the Acts of Peter, though, it seems absolutely necessary for the simple fact that Peter's deeds in this text conform, maybe too closely, to stereotypes of magical deeds. To put it bluntly, Simon and his magic have to be a literary contrast for Peter and his miracles, because the miracles in the Acts of Peter look a little too magical, at least to ancient audiences familiar with stereotypes of magic. In this way, the text teaches an audience to be wary of superficial similarities between magicians and miracle workers. It claims that if you're not properly rooted as a Christian, you're liable to be seduced by the demonic wiles of a sorcerer like Simon. So this is the order our author creates. Christian miracle is better than demonic magic because it prompts belief in Jesus. But the how and why of maintaining this order shouldn't be ignored. We should pay attention to how our author distinguishes Peter's deeds from Simon's. And we should never forget that Christian authors, like the author of the Acts of Peter, were always concerned with the why, because Christians' deeds were part of a larger stereotype of magic in the ancient world and could easily be taken as such. Understanding the how and why allows us to expose our text's ordering mechanisms and to see them for what they are, not neutral descriptions of the difference between magic and miracle that all ancient people might have adhered to, but instead persuasive writings designed to teach ancient people to see magic as evil. And so this, in a roundabout way, brings me back to the initial question I put forth into the Twitterverse. What's a lecture on ancient magic look like? The answer is it can be about lots of things, from amulets to literary texts to ritual practices to the ancients' own ideas of magic. But among the many, many lectures we could write about ancient magic and Christianity, we should carry forward three things. One, we're attempting to bring order onto the world of ancient magic, and that means we can never capture all of it in whatever analyses we create. Two, our texts are also bringing order in the same way, and we shouldn't take their orderly ideas at face value. And three, if we think about the how and why of magic's use in early Christian texts, we can see how magic's messiness was actually an asset to our writers. Because it was so unwieldy and contradictory, ancient authors could leverage the allure of magical deeds while at the same time insisting Christians weren't doing magic. They could both participate in magic and not. Ancient magic wasn't some corruption of proper religion as we might imagine it in the modern world. It was part of a large landscape of ritual practices that existed prior to the development of Christianity. And no matter how strongly our authors may deny it, magic was instrumental in Christianity's development. When they tried to make sense of magic's messiness and to distinguish Christian wonders from it, our authors invented miracle. To me, this is one of the ancients' most impressive tricks. They got us to believe that rigid division between magic and Christianity is both self-evident and natural, as opposed to something that had to be sustained and solidified over and over again through writing. Ancient Christian writers like Luke, Origen, and the author of the Acts of Peter enchanted us all this time into thinking we could bring magic's unwieldiness to order. But I would claim that's an impossible task, and that one of the most wonderful things about ancient magic is its stubborn refusal to be boxed in. So my charge to us as historians is to get comfortable with the chaos, with the idea that we can never capture or know everything about the past. And that when we define ancient magic, we should ask ourselves who we're defining it for. What's the purpose of the order we're trying to make, and who does it benefit? And with that challenge, I'll end my lecture. Thank you all so much.
As always, I like to give a little bit of a round of applause. That was a phenomenal lecture. I, as a graduate student here at Stanford, am quite interested in the Aramaic incantation bowls. So for me, this lecture was so exciting, and I do have a ton of questions to ask. But I'm going to try to just pull out the most important ones here. So just kind of jumping right in, one of the big questions that I have here is the scope of magic. And by that, I kind of mean, what are we looking at magic as kind of an everyday experience? Or are we looking at it as something much larger at like a more theological level? And I think defining the level of power that we kind of attribute to it or give to it is something that's kind of important. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably the number one question, right? Like the question that people have, which is, how do we even talk about magic, right? And what does it mean in the ancient world and even in the modern world to label somebody as a magician? And so one of the things that that I try to get across to students and also in my talks is this disconnect between our literary texts and what we know about people on the ground. And what we seem to know about people on the ground is that you could go to the marketplace and maybe purchase an exorcism or a charm for healing. We have things like curse tablets, right, where people are trying to bind lovers to themselves or separate lovers from others. And so we have these practices that are explicitly called magic in literary texts that everyday people are participating in. We also have some evidence that everyday people, well, maybe not everyday people, but that people might have understood that magic was not necessarily a positive thing, but participated in it anyway. And so I'm thinking of like Lucian's Pharsalia, where you have a character whose name escapes me, oh my gosh, who knows that going to be trained by this witch is going to lead him into this spiral and ruin his life. But he wants to do it anyway because magic is alluring. And so you have this contradiction between this allure of magic and this broader notion that maybe magic isn't something you should participate in. But you also have texts that evaluate magic in a positive way. And so here I'm thinking, or at least a neutral way, right? So like here I'm thinking about things like the Derveni Papyrus, where magicians are said to be guardians of souls, right? After death. And so, it's really tough to say, like, what did everyday people think about magic? Because you have, again, this vast sort of contradictory discourse, and you have people interacting with magic in different ways. So like one of the things that we struggle with as scholars of ancient magic is like, what do you do with Egyptian religion? Is it magic? Is it religion? right? If magic is always bad, then what are you going to do with that? Or what are you going to do with something like the Greek magical papyri, where you do have, in a few rare instances, um, the spells themselves calling the user magician? Um, what do you do with that? Is that religion? Is it magic, right? And so I think that our modern categories, again, try to impose this conceptual control. And that's where your question about power is really important, right? Because we as historians have this power to select what we think is evidence. So we select what we think is magic. But we also have the power to sequence it in particular ways, or to exclude certain evidence, like Egyptian religion, or to include certain evidence, like, people who study New Testament often use the Greek magical papyri as a foil for the practices in the New Testament. Well, the PGM have a very particular provenance. And so can we say that those are reflective of practices in the entire ancient Mediterranean? I'm not sure that we can. And so when we impose this conceptual control, that to me is an act of power, right? Like defining for ourselves and determining what ancient people defined as magic is us taking this massive, unwieldy thing that resists being put under control and trying to put it under control.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm just going over these questions now that we have in the chat, and there's a bunch. And I think there's one question that I kind of want to ask that I think we'll cover 2 or 3 at once. And it's essentially, what evidence, and this is kind of built off of one of the last few things you said, that, magic was an ancient practice, it predates Christianity. So what evidence do we consider Christian then, right? I think that is a really kind of categorical issue that we're going to run into, especially if we start to accept the contradictions, and especially in light of history that predated Christianity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so in this talk, I'm talking about New Testament texts, right? And I'm talking about church fathers, and I'm talking about apocryphal acts that all sort of put Jesus at the center. Well, one of the things that we know about ancient groups is that they weren't neat. So this is another issue of conceptual control, right? Like we know, for example, that, groups, and I'm thinking now of like David Brackey's work in particular, that groups were porous, far more porous than we think that they were, and that people could have held multiple affiliations. And so again, right, like I think our texts are trying to clean up what's going on the ground. And so when when we think about what counts as Christian, that's another thing that we decide as historians, right? Like we decide what's magic, we decide what counts as Christian. And again, that to me is an exercise of power.
Phenomenal. And we did get one question here that is really kind of interesting. And it's, what do you think about the overlap between magic and medicine? Are Christians choosing ancient magic over magic in their retelling of Jesus' stories?
Are Christians, could you repeat the question?
Are Christians choosing ancient medicine over magic? Sorry, I misspoke. Ancient medicine over magic in the retelling of Jesus' stories?
That's a good point. I think it depends on the text, which is probably what you're expecting me to say. So if you look at something, for example, like Luke's text, there seems to be a sort of elision between the categories of healing and exorcism. And so, healings almost work kind of like exorcisms, right? And so like healings slide over from something that we might think of as medicine to something that looks more like magical practice, right? But again, there's a slipperiness, and we see the slipperiness in specific texts. So if you read on the sacred disease, there the author makes a distinction between what constitutes what we would call medicine and what constitutes like magic. So he would say, that medicine is from the gods. Like there's something natural about medicine. It's part of the natural realm, right? So whereas, you know, magic is mostly charlatanry. Like we got these people like coming in and, you know, describing, you know, burning incense and all these things, whereas the author, who is sort of elevating medicine, is saying that, well, no, medicine has a logic to it, right? There's a reason that we tell you not to eat certain things when you're feeling sick, or there's a reason that we prescribe certain things. Whereas, you know, these charlatan magicians just come in and they're like, hey, you need to, I don't know, burn some incense. And so these distinctions that we see between something like magic and something like medicine are distinctions that have to be reified through discourse over and over and over again. The book that I always go back to is Heidi Wentz at the Temple Gates, which is one of my favorite books about the ancient world. And one of the things that I think is really useful about her approach is that she talks about a class of freelance religious experts. And this class of experts was notoriously or magicians, or, you know, people who are explaining scripture, and all of those people would be smushed into this difficult, undifferentiated class of specialists. And so our literature, our literary texts are trying to distance themselves, right, by doing the work of labeling, by doing the work of distinction, and by trying to maintain that distance through practices of writing.
Perfect. And as we just approach the end, we have only about 2 more minutes left. And so I'm just going to ask one question on a point that you left off on. You kind of made, when you were talking about the Acts of Peter, a comparison between Peter and Simon and God and Satan, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm really kind of interested here at the nexus of magic, good and evil, and the ability for magic or magical acts to kind of convert something from being good to being evil, such as the resurrection of fish versus necromancy, which, I'm sorry, from my perspective, is kind of the same thing. So what is this kind of interplay that's going on between these three really kind of major concepts that we as scholars work with?
Right. So in that text, what's going on is that, like, this battle between Simon and evil, and Simon and Peter, and the way that the text sort of places Simon in this larger epic history, makes the fight between two religious specialists into something way bigger, right? Like, it's a Marvel movie now. And so it becomes this cosmic thing. And we see this in a lot of our Christian texts. So like someone like Luke is going to be talking about how, you know, is going to plug Jesus into the fulfillment of prophecy. And so Christian texts tend to take, you know, just things that ritual specialists do and sort of make them epic, right? And turn them into this cosmic battle between good and evil and God and Satan. And I think this is where we get that idea that, quote, religion and magic are obverses, right? That magic is some evil obverse of religion. It's because, you know, our texts are making it huge, right? Whereas probably on the ground is just two people trying to make money handing out exorcisms, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's always really interesting to kind of consider the concept of evil, in my opinion. But at any rate, we are out of time for today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
No, thank you for everything. This has been a really great experience, and honestly, I think this is going to help me with my exams in the fall. So I really appreciate it.
Good luck on your exams.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming out.
Yeah, thank you everyone.